This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with R. Sikoryak. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek, one of the two guys with PhDs talking about comics, and on this interview episode I have the pleasure of talking with R. Sikoryak. His new book, The Unquotable Trump, came out this week from Drawn and Quarterly. But before we get to that fascinating conversation, I want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by those wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price, and every single month you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off the cover price, sometimes 50% off of the cover, but every now and again you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that. And as they have every month, you'll find quite a number of great specials on not only single issues, but on bundles from such publishers as DC, Marvel, and Valiant. But because today I'm talking with Robert Sikoryak, it's worth mentioning that you can find several of his books at great discounts. So, for instance, his brand new book, The Unquotable Trump, you can find for 30% off of the cover price. That's $13.97. You can also find for 30% off of the cover price Terms and Conditions that came out just this spring. You pay only $10.47. And if you want his classic masterpiece comics, you can get that at 25% off of the cover price. That's $14.96. You can't beat the prices of Discount Comic Book Service, whether you're looking for books by Robert Sikoryak or others. That's dcbservice.com. You gotta go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. I had a great time talking with Bob Sikoryak. His new book, The Unquotable Trump, came out a couple of days ago from Drawn and Quarterly. Now, I've had Bob on the Comics Alternative before. A couple of years ago, I spoke with him briefly at Small Press Expo. And then before that, I did a small interview with him on the Comics Alternative blog. So although he's not new to the Comics Alternative, this was the first time that we had a really serious, sit-down, leisurely conversation. And we covered quite a number of topics. Obviously, we discussed his new book, The Unquotable Trump. But we also talked about some of his other works as well. For instance, Terms and Conditions, which was released as a complete collection from Drawn and Quarterly this spring, as well as some of his classic literary parodies. It was a great conversation, and I know you'll enjoy it. So here it is, my interview with R. Sikoryak. I'm pleased to have back on the Comics Alternative Robert Sikoryak. He has a new book that is coming out on October 24th from Drawn and Quarterly, The Unquotable Trump. Bob, how you doing?
I'm pretty good. I'm sorry I had to make this book.
You're sorry you had to make this book. Explain, please.
Well, we got a president who I think is doing terrible damage to America, and if I had my druthers, I would be an obscure cartoonist again, doing adaptations of literary classics that most people haven't read.
Yeah, I was thinking before we started this interview that it is quite, maybe a step down is a way of putting it, to go from parody and literary classics to parody and Donald Trump.
Yeah. I would say it's a step. Yes, it's a step into the abyss.
Yes. And, on the other hand, I've heard other people in the entertainment industry, such as comedians, say that as much as they may dislike Donald Trump, he is good for business.
I have mostly heard comedians say, no, thank you. I don't know who said that, but he certainly is good for business. Yes. But I think he's terrible for our lives. So I'm going to say that I have plenty of material. People always say, oh, he gives you so much material. I was like, I don't need material. I have all of Western literature to work with. I don't need any more. Thank you. I think you got me started. I was going to say don't get me started, but it's too late.
Okay, so we've been talking kind of around this new book, but let's talk specifically about it. For our listeners who may not be acquainted with this or who may not have seen it solicited or listed on Amazon.com, describe what the Unquotable Trump is all about.
Well, right before the election, which was giving me terrible anxiety, I thought it would be appropriate, it would be interesting, it would be effective to take the words of Donald Trump that were spoken during the campaign and put them and his image into old comic book covers. This is something that a lot of people have done before to one degree or another. But I thought specifically just using his words, because all of my work tends to play with found text and found materials. So just taking his words and putting direct quotes and his image into old comic book covers, I thought that would be an effective kind of protest, an effective way of expressing my anxiety, concern, outrage, etc. about the whole situation that America found itself in. This was like November 2nd of last year, and I thought, I don't want to think about him anymore. And, if everything works out, I won't have to next week when the election happens. And then the election happened, and it turned out I did have to keep thinking about him, and I thought, well, I'll make this thing. I knew it was a good idea. I tweeted about it. I know I use Twitter too. I'm one of those other people that uses Twitter. I tweeted about it on November 2nd, and I said, I had this great idea. I was actually the idea sort of came out of this Obama parody called Tea Party Comics. That's pretty outrageous and politically opposite of my point of view. But I thought it was, a provocative way of dealing with political figures, putting them into old comic books. I'd certainly done parodies of politicians as superheroes before, but in this case, I was putting him sort of in the place of supervillains. In any case, I tweeted about it right before the election. I said, someone should do this because I think it's a good idea. And then after the election, I was like, I guess I'll do it after all. So I thought, I really don't want to think about him that much. So I cranked out 17 comic book covers with him and his quotes, the most famous ones I could think of from the campaign. And I drew them and printed them as a black and white 16-page mini comic. And then I posted them online as well, because that's what I do. And almost immediately I got a huge response, an enthusiastic response. And my publisher, Drawn and Quarterly, called me, specifically Peggy Burns, and said, this is great. Do you want to make a book? And I hadn't really thought about it. I honestly thought I was making this kind of punk zine to get it out of my system, and also just to sort of say, I object. But she said, let's make it a book. Let's make it an oversized book. Let's make it a 48-page oversized color book. And I thought, all right, by that point, he had just been, he was about to be inaugurated. And, it was clear he was going to be president. And I thought, well, let's make this thing. So I spent the next 7 months. I spent the next 5 or 6 months doing 30 more covers. Had a friend, Chris Bonnell, help me with the coloring. I revised the drawings, refined things, got all the footnotes together, and made the book very quickly. So it's maybe the closest thing to a periodical I've ever put out, because it's very topical, and it came together very quickly. And every time I started to enjoy working on it, I thought, oh, but he's still president, and I just got terribly sad. So the experience of making it was really a roller coaster, as they say. Not unlike the world we're living in now.
Yeah.
I went depressed before he started picking fights with North Korea. So, there's more and more and more. Can you think of one comedian who actually said this is good for business? Because I can't. But I mean, please, I'd like to know.
I can't remember exactly who, but it maybe not. They said it exactly like that, but in so many words, they were saying that as bad as he is, there's a lot of material here for us to work with. So something like that. I mean, I'm not suggesting that a comedian said, "Hey, I'm glad he's president," just because he provides me with a lot of material, but the sentiment that he easily provides comedic material, I think, has been voiced by a number of comedians. And I mean, you could definitely see that in the late night crowd.
I think the only reason I really don't like describing it this way, but I think the only reason that it works as quote unquote comedic material is that the stakes are so high, and that so many people are getting hurt, and so many people are being dismissed, and so many countries are hating us again.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's I'm using quotes. It's funny because it's true, mm-hmm. and because it's terrible. I find that I like to hear comedians sort of take apart what he's doing. I think Colbert is doing a really good job. I mm-hmm. think Seth Meyers is doing a really good job. I think John Oliver and Samantha Bee are doing important work. And I think the President Show on Comedy Central is really great because it's so nasty and crude, and it seems appropriate. But it's mainly in the sense of relief that someone is addressing what I think is a really dangerous situation. So I've been pleased that people have seen the book and laughed at it, and seem to get some comfort. I think I've heard that word in terms of seeing it and appreciating the sense of humor, I guess, that I'm adding to it, mm-hmm. or the sensibility that I'm adding to it. But I think it's because the situation is so traumatic for so many people that that's the reason that it has an effect. So I made this book very fast. I think I felt like I wanted to sort of say something and sort of let the world know that not everyone in America thinks what's going on now is a good idea. It's very complicated for me to sort of untangle the way I feel about it as something I made and the response to it in the world. I'm gratified people like it, but it seems like I feel like I'm playing with fire.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm still trying to unpack kind of what it is. This is very much unlike most of the work that I make. I've worked for Mad Magazine. I've worked for The Daily Show, with Jon Stewart. I've worked, I've done some political work before, but this is the most intense period I've spent, like, sort of thinking about one politician and trying to sort of like make work about him. So I should probably let you ask some questions.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the intensity of this project, along with the fact that it was relatively quick. So I can imagine doing this within a relatively short time span was almost like an emotionally volcanic experience.
Oh yeah. And I mean, for the time I was making it, I was like listening to what was being said. I was sort of going back and going, what has he said about healthcare? Like, I was trying to cover like certain topics that I hadn't already done in those first 16 images. And because by the time I was working on the book, the campaign had long passed. It was already, February, March, April of this year, and it seemed like the velocity had just picked up. So I was trying to sort of keep up with what was happening now, and also, make sure I sort of cataloged all of his opinions and all of his outlooks. So it was a lot of reading about stuff that he said a year ago or 2 years ago, and sort of keeping up with what's happening now. So it was just like a lot to juggle, and it was it entailed all the things I enjoy doing, but it was in the service of something that I'm very upset about. And I'm sure I know some cartoonists, and perhaps they listen to your show, who would completely disagree with me politically, but I think they would understand. They've been here before, mm-hmm. with one president or the other, so they can probably sympathize with what I'm saying, even if they disagree with what I did.
One of the things I was curious to hear is that this started out as a 16-page minicomic. Yes. Now, I haven't seen that, and because I was going to ask you, had he not won the presidency, might you have gone on with this project maybe in a more low-key manner, such as a 16-page comic? But you wanted to do that mini-comic close to the beginning of this idea, correct?
Well, that's what I thought it was. I thought it was a mini. Like I said, I thought of it at the beginning of November. I was about to have a table at Comic Arts Brooklyn, which was like the following weekend. So I had like 4 days before that con, and I had my terms and conditions book to promote that year, because I had advanced copies. Or at least it was about to come out. So I was sort of promoting that as, my upcoming book. But I thought, well, I'd like to sort of say something about this election. I tend not to speak about politics on social media and on Facebook, which is social media, of course, but on Twitter and so forth. I don't generally get into politics. I don't, as you know, from my work, I tend not to express my opinions. I like to sort of filter what I'm interested in through other sources. So, I made the mini after the election just because it felt necessary. If he had lost the election, I frankly think he still would have been a recurring problem because I don't think he would have suddenly shut up.
Right.
And certainly I knew that he had gathered a fan base, some of whom were really offensive trolls. So not all of them. Not saying it's a whole basket. I'm just saying that there were some that that he had emboldened into being aggressively offensive. So I'm not sure what I would have done then. It wasn't until he won that I felt like, I really need to. I really feel like I need to say this.
Yeah, Hillary wasn't too far off base when she made the basket of deplorables comment. Maybe not the wisest thing for her to do at that point in the campaign, but again, not that off base. Well,
yeah. I mean, I didn't want to talk about her in the book. I have issues with Hillary Clinton. I disagreed with many things she's done, but I felt like she was the adult in the room, and I would have happily, I would have gratefully settled for her. And I think we would have agreed on enough things that I would have not been protesting multiple times as I have since Trump became elected, at least not so fast. It seems like every week I hear about something that is happening, and I don't go out and protest all the time, but I'm certainly very supportive of a lot of the things that are going on, or a lot of the resistance that's going on right now.
Yeah. Now, this book that's coming out on October 24th, you mentioned that it's 48 pages, and so basically we have 48 comic book covers, many of them very classic and recognizable comic book covers, where you have injected Donald Trump in a parodic manner. You said a moment ago, though, that you have a lot of material. Is there a possibility that you will come out with another book of Unquotable Trump?
Do you want more?
I do. The thing is, after you explaining how, I guess, somewhat painful it was to immerse yourself in Trumpdom, I don't know if I want to suggest another book if it's not pleasant for you.
Well, no, I mean, as I said, there were pleasurable things about making the book. It's the reality that's unpleasurable. I can't really separate the two. I mean, we'll see what happens. I sound like the president. Mm-hmm. I'll keep you in suspense. But no, I don't know yet. I really needed to step away from it. When the book was done, I was really grateful. I think the book does a good job of sort of cataloging his various ideas about different issues that have come up since. It's the same way people say they go back to things that he said 5 years ago that sort of like clearly sometimes contradict, but often like show that this is the same guy who has been talking for so long. There's certainly things that I would like to address that aren't in the book. I might do a second volume. I have to say the main reason I would want to do it is that I hate leaving the story on a cliffhanger. But it's not a story. So I don't know yet. I've started to think about possibilities for doing more, but it's not coming out in 6 months. I can tell you that. We'll see how things are going in some time. I just don't know yet. I have not drawn him since the book. Like I'm not keeping up with it. Warren Craighead has been doing daily drawings of him, and he has a book out called Trump, and they're very grotesque drawings, and they're quite beautiful in their horribleness. Mm-hmm. And then Shannon Wheeler has been doing his illustrations of Trump tweets. His book came out.
Oh, that's right. Shit my president says.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I believe he's still cataloging some of them. But I'm gonna like let this percolate a little while and see what happens with the book. Maybe I'll be sent to jail for libel. Who knows? Anything's possible.
Yeah, he's a very litigious person.
I'm very unfair. I'm also little. I should also point out I'm little. I'm a loser. I'm not president. And I'm many of the things that he has insulted before. Although I'm a white man, so maybe I'm okay.
Yeah. Just don't show him the size of your hands.
Right.
Yeah. Right. You mentioned the kind of intensity in terms of the turnaround time on this. One of the things that I find quite impressive is the fact that you did a lot of research and documentation, and we can see this on the inside back cover, which you titled Failing Media Sources. And so not only do you have a bibliography with all 48 illustrations as to where you found this information, right? So no one could accuse you of participating in the fake media unless the original sources are fake and then you're just propagating this. But you also indicate what you're parodying. And, you know, the list of comics classics, especially when it comes to the mainstream, is just astounding. I mean, you got Jack Kirby, John Romita, you know, Wally Wood, Gene Colan, even more contemporary people like Charlie Adlard with the Walking Dead parody. So, I mean, you really run the gamut here in terms of styles and genres and where you insert Donald Trump in a parodic manner. And I was wondering what went into your decision-making process as to what covers to parody, what creators to emulate in terms of the art style, and how to pair the particular covers and artists with whatever it was Trump was saying. You know, whether it be about women or healthcare or what have you.
Well, some of them were very obvious. Like the quote about Obamacare, I knew I would use some medical comic. I looked at a bunch of Charlton nurse covers. Mm-hmm. I ended up just liking the composition of one of the night nurse covers for Marvel from the 70s, so I ended up using that. You know, I wanted to make sure, like in my last two books, I was trying to sort of like move out of my comfort zone and also sort of reference different comics that various people might know. So even if people might not know the Adventure Time cover or The Walking Dead or 300 by Frank Miller, you know, they would certainly know the Spider-Man parody. I mean, they might not know the cover, but they would certainly know the character. Mm-hmm. So they would recognize Spider-Man or Superman, or you know, any of the others. So I was trying to be Catholic with a lowercase c in mm-hmm. terms of choices, and again, kind of suggest that in his way, Trump has infected all of American comic book history.
Now, have you or your publisher, Drawn and Quarterly, sent the White House a copy of your book?
I don't believe so, but I was really happy to see that Jake Tapper had tweeted a photo of the cover saying, "Look what came in the mail today." And that was nice. So I know that various failing media sources have been sent copies. So we'll see who responds. And yeah, as far as the footnotes that you mentioned earlier, I wanted to make sure everything was cataloged, because every once in a while I would show the covers to someone and they would say, "He really said that?" Like they still couldn't quite believe it. So I was like, yeah, they're all documented. So mm-hmm. I thought that was very important. Of course, my sources were often from the New York Times or CNN, sources that our president doesn't believe in anymore. So there you go.
Exactly. And, you know, this may be, I guess, akin to asking someone to choose their favorite child. But is there a favorite, or are there favorites of from these various 48 covers that you created? I mean, ones that you really do like, that kind of you have a soft spot for?
Yeah, it's hard to express soft spot when it comes to these covers.
Yeah, maybe wrong phrase choice.
I think the cover on page 14, which is Trump suspense stories, which emulates a Wally Wood cover, is really effective. It actually creeped me out a little bit when I drew it. It's essentially Trump saying, "I don't know anything about what you're even talking about with white supremacy or white supremacists. You wouldn't want me to condemn a group I know nothing about," and so on and so forth. And he's set in the middle of this scene, this rather provocative scene that Wally Wood has set up with these hooded Klansman-like figures and a woman tied up in the foreground. So that one I think isn't funny,
Right.
but is rather sobering. I think my favorite one is probably the one on page 34, which is called Nasty Woman. It's based on an old Wonder Woman cover where in the original she's tossing. I think she's actually tossing Mars, God of War, over the side of a tower. I think it's Mars. Anyway, Mars has been replaced by Trump, and he's saying "such a nasty woman."
Yeah,
that one is the one I think people are glad to see because it offers us that one maybe offers a little catharsis. So, but I mean, like I said, I tried very hard to run the gamut of sources, and certainly I leaned heavily into the Marvel and DC world because I feel like it was a natural place to put him in opposition to heroes who usually have rather traditional morality, or ideas of right and wrong, which he obviously is sort of stepping over or stepping aside.
Right. And with all your Marvel cover references, the publisher is titled Merica Comics, apostrophe Merica Comics. I like that. Yeah.
Thanks. Whenever possible, I tried to come up with relevant names for all the various companies that put out the comics.
Yeah. I liked in particular, well, I love the entire book, but one that stood out for me is on page 20 is, a classic Carmine Infantino cover with the Flash now that you've titled The Flack, and Donald Trump is saying, I know what I'm doing and I listen to a lot of people. I talk to a lot of people, and at the appropriate time I'll tell you who the people are, but my primary consultant is myself, and I have a good instinct for this stuff. And of course, in this series of mirrors, it's one Trump after another, which I think is rather telling. I mean, this is a guy who can't think in terms other than himself and how it relates to himself. So it's all me, all ego. And so these multiple images of Trump, instead of, in the original, what was it, the Mirror Master, in the mirrors, I think is rather appropriate. But I do have to say that one of my favorites is not inside the book, but it's actually on the back cover, where you parody a title that I would guess many readers may not recognize. You take an old Basil Wolverton illustrated plop cover, and you retitle it Trump, the magazine of world news, and you have this appropriately crazy Wolverton figure that looks like Donald Trump saying, it's true, I'm a supermodel. I'm on the cover of the biggest magazines. I don't even know about it. I can't even read the story because if I did, I wouldn't get any work done. And Plop was a favorite of mine as a kid. So when I saw that on the back cover, I immediately became gleeful.
Oh, that's great. Well, someone asked me, what's the most obscure cover you've done? As I was working on them, and he suggested I do a plop cover, and I thought,
good.
Great. I thought that's excellent. That's the kind of thing I wanted. I obviously, for the most part, for the interior of the book, I tried to choose like very well-known characters in opposition to Trump. But for the back cover, I wanted to show him without other people, without other characters, and also I really liked that quote, because it almost seems as if the book is doing him a favor by putting him on more covers, since he enjoys that so much. So I like that he was so self-referential that I could use his self-referentiality to be referential to this book that he didn't know existed. So that level of meta, and he is a very meta president in some ways, I suppose. Yeah, I'm enjoying talking to you about this, and I hope I'm not sounding aggressively dour, but it's really hard for me to separate, my thrill of making comics with just the situation, because as I say, it's very fraught for me right now. Mm-hmm. I am a sad little snowflake. Don't you know? So, it's hard to talk about this. And perhaps if any conservative or Republican cartoonists are listening, they'll enjoy listening to me squirm. But hopefully the rest of your listeners won't mind.
Yeah, I'm sure they'll get a kick out of it once they get their copies, if they don't have one already.
Now, just listening to me, yeah.
Now, again, this comes out on the 24th of October, and that's actually the day after we're recording this interview. The interview will go up after the release date. But now you have been, over the past few months, to a variety of different comics conventions. I know you were at SPX because that's how I got my copy. My good friend Pascal Hammond I was going to room with him there. I couldn't go this year, and his way of saying sorry you couldn't make it was to get this for me and have you sign it, which I really appreciated. So you had copies at SPX. You just got back from MICE, and so you've been carrying this around with you. What kind of reaction have you gotten from readers who have actually had the opportunity to see the Unquotable Trump?
Well, I've gotten a lot of praise for it. It's really hard to speak about this because every time I say a lot of people are really enjoying it, we were having a good time. Like I just sound like the president again. Yeah. I think my favorite thing is to sit behind a comics convention table and watch people look at it and laugh at stuff and get really engrossed in it. That has been really fun. Like I said, a lot of people who probably wouldn't be that interested in my other work. I think obviously there's a way into this. I mean, he's big and brash on the cover. So if you can get past that, then I think people have seen the humor in it. The one thing I would say is, I said I told you I made this zine in January. I had printed it out and started distributing it. I sold 4,000 mini comics of the 16-page version. I've never sold that many mini comics. That's probably more copies than I sold of my first book from Fantagraphics. 4,000 copies is astonishing to me. So I think people have found this of interest to them. I haven't gotten. I've mostly gotten compliments. A couple of people. One person I know on Twitter on the left, and one person I know on Facebook on the right have kind of called me to task over it. But for the most part, people have gotten the humor and have really appreciated the approach.
Well, what, if you don't mind me asking, how did they take you to task, or what were their gripes with the Unquotable Trump?
Well, the friend of mine on the right basically felt that I was being unfair to Trump, that he's a good man and that he was trying. And why do liberals hate him so much? And then he said, why didn't you do a book on Crooked Hillary? And this is a thoughtful guy. I really don't like talking about politics online, but of course these covers that I've been doing have been posted many times, and I've been promoting the book. So he got rather upset at me for, not being more loving. And I said, I'm sorry, we're going to just disagree. I don't like his policies, and, I don't think we should talk about this online. So I haven't seen him in person. I'd be happy to have what would probably be a 5-hour conversation, but I just didn't want to get into it on Facebook. And then the other person I know is a cartoonist, and he was essentially saying that Shannon Wheeler and I were both exploiting a terrible situation, and we were privileged middle-aged white men who were getting book deals making fun of this terrible situation. I am a privileged white middle-aged man. So, I mean, that is true. I understand. I actually expected more people who agreed with me politically to be upset that I was giving Trump more airtime. I think there's some argument to be made about not putting his name on things anymore. But when I came up with the conceit for the book, the pieces sort of fell into place. I thought it used my skills to comment on the situation well. So this is the thing that came out of it. I was very surprised that it became a book, because I did not think that's what it was going to be. But the response has been very, very enthusiastic. So.
Okay, let's momentarily leave Trump aside. We can come back to the Unquotable Trump. But let me make you a little more comfortable by talking about your work on a more palatable public figure, and that is Steve Jobs. Now,
it's palatable to some.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of Steve Jobs, but I know he's a very divisive figure.
Right.
Not
relative to Donald Trump, though.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, I was first familiar with your iTunes terms and condition in those two rather hefty mini comics that you put out back in, I think, 2015, the unabridged graphic adaptation of iTunes terms and conditions. And in fact, that was one of the titles that my colleague and I, Andy, on the Comics Alternative, at the very end of 2015, listed as one of our favorites of the year. But earlier this year, you came out with a complete, I think it was it hardbound or paperbound? I can't remember.
It's paperback.
Paperback of the iTunes terms and conditions. And that came out in the spring. I'm wondering, my guess would be that the book reached a larger audience than the mini comics did. Maybe I'm wrong there, but I'm curious about the reaction to that book that came out in the spring.
It definitely reached more people. What happened with the mini comics was the printed editions reached some people. I didn't actually sell. I don't think I sold 1,000 of the 2 volumes put together of the mini comic. But I had posted them on Tumblr, and at a certain point, Boing Boing wrote a piece about the Tumblr site, and then at that point, I'd gotten a lot of interviews, a lot of notice, and a lot of attention, which was very gratifying. And then, as you say, in 2017, around March, Drawn and Quarterly released a paperback, unabridged, full color edition of the most recent update of the terms. I actually went back and updated the text to match the text as of the date that I made the color edition. So that I don't know what the sales figures were, but I've been very pleased with the response to that. Again, the best experiences I have are sitting behind a table, either telling people what it is and having them pick it up and look at it and shake their head and try to figure out what it is exactly, or just laugh. Some people just laugh at it, which is, I think, a perfectly appropriate response. Maybe the biggest thing that came out of that for me was that the New York Times did an interview with me and did a long article and published 4 of the pages in the print edition of the New York Times, which was kind of astonishing that they gave it so much play. It was a really good interview, and I'm really grateful that they decided to cover it. I imagined that book was kind of a conceptual exercise, but it was also kind of me trying to struggle with the way that comics had evolved in the 20 plus years since I began working professionally, where I came from the alternative comics scene, where most of my work would consist of short form comics that were eventually collected into a book. But this was the first time when I tried to make a long form comic, a graphic novel, frankly, and that was me sort of trying to address the way I'd seen the world had changed around me, and also the opportunity that I could make a project that started as an exercise and kind of like a challenge for myself, that it could actually come out as a book, Somehow I hit upon the Venn diagram of people that love the internet and people that love comics or something. I'm not quite sure what the diagram is. People that love tech jargon and people that love Tumblr. And somehow I'd reached a new audience, and I'd confounded a lot of people, which I also enjoy doing with my comics. So it's not that confounding, but I think at first glance it certainly it suggested that it's a new way of thinking about comics. But ultimately, it's kind of really just a way to sort of embrace all kinds of comics. Even though the text is not related to the images, they both come together in a new way, hopefully.
Yeah, and for our listeners who aren't familiar with the unabridged iTunes terms and conditions, what you've done is to take, in an unabridged manner, word for word, the actual iTunes terms and conditions. And then you have retold, so to speak, the terms and conditions, not cutting anything out, by using for each page a particular creator, a comic creator's style. And with Steve Jobs as a character. And so Steve Jobs will appear different on each page depending on what comics artist you are employing at that time. But what's going on the page, you're right, is disjointed from the text, which is the iTunes terms and conditions. And so, how can you create a story out of that? There is a story there. The story is more in the art. But the interesting thing about the iTunes terms and conditions is this disconnection between the actual text and the illustrations, which I think is just wonderful. And so I was glad that it came out as one volume earlier this year.
Thanks. Well, just to clarify a little bit farther, the idea was, since there was no, in my opinion, the poetry fans may disagree, but in my opinion, there was no plot, there was no real narrative in the terms. That meant that I could import stories from elsewhere. So each page is not just drawn in the style of a cartoonist, but it's actually based on a particular page of a cartoonist's work. Mm-hmm. So also in the back of the Drawn and Quarterly edition, which is called Terms and Conditions, in the back of that book, each page is listed so you could actually compare my version to the version in the original comic. Yeah. So it's not just in the style of Peanuts, but it's based on a specific Sunday page of Peanuts.
Right, and you're documenting as you do at the very back of Unquotable Trump.
Yes. And while the characters are dressed in the costume of Steve Jobs, I don't think of them as Steve Jobs. I think of them as people posing as him, the same way that someone else can wear Batman's costume if Bruce Wayne's back is broken, for instance. So it's a matter of it's the disguise that they take on because they're still living their own lives. One of the most gratifying responses I've gotten to the book, though, was as a lecture I gave to a group of lawyers. Someone had come up to me because lawyers are fascinated by the way I've taken a legal document and made a comic out of it. In any case, I brought this book to that audience, and I did a slideshow. And afterwards, someone came up to me and said that he'd worked with Apple back in, I believe he said in the 90s, and he felt that it was a real tribute to Steve Jobs, and that he felt that somehow that I somehow honored Jobs by making this book, which I thought was fascinating. The stories of the characters don't echo the story of Steve Jobs, but enough different things happen that you can perhaps see facets of his personality in specific interactions he has. When he's beating up giant gorillas because it's Hellboy dressed as Steve Jobs, or when he's arguing with little Lulu because it's Tubby dressed as Steve Jobs. that perhaps there's like some aspect of his drive or his humanity that comes through. It's not all fighting in the book, but because I was working with a lot of classic comics, there's a lot of melodramatic poses and there's a lot of big action beats. But some of it's more romantic, some of it's more based on crime comics, some of it's based on zombie comics. It's all over the place. But hopefully again, as I've been trying to do more and more lately, I've been trying to sort of like touch the styles of different artists that I've loved, that I haven't had a chance to do in my other work previously.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I think I read somewhere that your first attempt at comics parody, where you take a text from some other source, non-comic source, and then you parody it using a particular creator style or what have you, in retelling the text, was something that you first did when you worked with Art Spiegelman in Raw. Is that correct?
Well, the two earliest, the first one of my adaptations of a literary classic was done for Raw, and it was done in 1989, and it was my version of Dante's Inferno, retold.
Oh, yeah. Bazooka Joe, yeah.
Were you thinking of a different?
No. I was trying to remember which one it was, but it's the Bazooka Joe.
Yes.
Parody, yes.
So that was me, I guess, being a bit of a wise ass, because essentially I was saying, like, well, I can take an epic poem that is an immortal classic, and I can combine it with the most disposable comic strip ever, which is the Bazooka Joe bubblegum wrappers that had comics on them. So it started as a goof, but the next one I did in that series was good old Gregor Brown, where I combined Peanuts with Kafka's Metamorphosis. And there I felt like there was parallels between Charlie Brown and Gregor Samsa, the character who becomes a bug. And as I was writing it and drawing it, I realized, and I was essentially using as much of Kafka's words as I could, and his words felt perfectly in sync with Peanuts. And that was the first time that I sort of recognized that I didn't just have to play with high culture versus low culture, but that I could really sort of let the characters from these different sources kind of grapple with each other and speak to each other and maybe echo each other in a way that, it was more of a fair fight, because as great as I think Kafka is, I think Peanuts is also very great.
Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, did your, how do I say this? I guess your love of parody, or at least your beginning love affair with comics parody, begin with those early pieces that you just mentioned, or was there something about this impulse even before that? In other words, what brought you to the kind of comics that you're primarily known for now? Well,
even as a kid, I was reading a lot of comics. My brothers and I would often do parodies of superhero comics when we were kids. I was making comics. I was making 4-panel comics that weren't Peanuts parodies, but were certainly like playing with the rhythms of Peanuts comics, like, because I had really absorbed that sort of newspaper rhythm of cartooning, of cartoon storytelling when I was very young. So I was sort of playing with variations on the work that I was reading, and I would say Peanuts and Marvel comics were probably my biggest influences, but I was reading a lot of other comics as a kid. When I was in college, I was making comics, but I felt like my work was a little slack and it was very derivative. And it also didn't have I didn't feel like it had enough structure to it. So somehow using the structures that I got from other places, and then also using the styles that I chose from other artists, helped give it a little bit more solidity. And I thought if I was going to be derivative regardless, I might as well be overtly derivative and consciously derivative, and also, not sort of like trying to pass my work off as quote unquote original when it was already derivative. I was also reading a lot of the work of John Cage, the composer who wrote a lot about his ideas of making art and about originality and about using chance in terms of the way that you create work. And I was really taken by his approach. And it seemed that a lot of what he was interested in doing was sort of like erasing his own personality and like letting the materials that he was working with kind of shine. And that really spoke to me. Mm-hmm. I've never felt like I've had a lot of original thoughts, but I feel like I have the impulse to create, and what could I create that would be distinct? And somehow, by being a parody artist, or a postmodernist, if you prefer, by doing that, I've sort of made an approach for myself that is distinct, and people do know me for that now, which seems counterintuitive, but seems to have happened.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned postmodern. It strikes me that that's a word that I don't hear as frequently as I used to, but what you're doing in many ways, I think, goes a long way to, I guess, resonate with how postmodernism has been defined. This kind of meshing of, high and low culture, the old and the new. The word mashup has been applied to your work quite a number of times, which again is a postmodern tendency. I mean, do you see yourself as a postmodern cartoonist?
Yeah, I probably need a newer word. I went to school in the 80s, and I think it's just a hangover from then. But I think when I'm trying to find the words to describe what I do, I think that's convenient. I think mashup is a fair word to use. I think the thing that I don't like about the term mashup is just that it usually refers to sort of combining two things in pop culture that don't belong, that's smushed together. And I've always tried to put something in my work that has more cognitive dissonance. Mm-hmm. I've always sort of wanted to put things together that really don't seem like they belong. And whether I'm forcing them together or I'm showing you that they do actually have something in common, I've always felt like it had something deeper to it than I think the word mashup usually implies. But there's a lot of mashups I like, so it's not as if I object to it, but it seems like it's a term that doesn't quite have. It doesn't suggest the depth that I'm going for, but I think it's technically accurate. I'm not even sure what postmodernism means anymore, but at the time when I was in school, it seemed like the right word.
Well, you have Steve Bannon using deconstruct incorrectly time and time again. That's one of my pet peeves. So, using the word postmodernism is incorrectly doesn't surprise me. Speaking of bringing together different disparate things and kind of creating something new from that, I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your Carousel series, because I've never been an audience member of one of these. They're too far away. But from what I understand, they are multimedia, and so you're bringing together different kind of media presentations in a way that's unique.
That's the hope. Yes, I mean, Carousel is my series of performances by cartoonists, visual artists, sometimes photographers, musicians, and other performance types. And it originally started because I had begun doing readings of my comics in the 90s and using a slide projector, which is why the show is called Carousel. And it was a way for me to present my work for people who wouldn't necessarily see it in other places. before the internet was really a common thing. It was a way to sort of get my work out into the world in a new way. And when I was in school, I started becoming very interested in performance art. And while that can sometimes imply something more avant-garde, I feel like the carousel shows have more of a vaudeville feel to them, which was also big in the 90s. They tend to be short readings from cartoonists and performances by different people. So in my initial shows, I had people who might play music while they showed slides, or people who would narrate photo essays that they had made while the images were projected. Over the years, I've incorporated more live drawing. I do a lot of live painting during the events. I've had people like Matthew Thurber do scroll presentations where he'll do a drawing on a very long scroll and like tell a story while he's like manipulating the images to slide across the scroll. Or I have someone who does someone named Brian Dewan who makes film strips, which was a technology used in grade schools, and that I remember it from when I was a kid, where it would be like a pre-recorded text on like cassette tape that would accompany a slide presentation. Actually, a roll of film that you'd move through, and these would always be educational. And his tend to be very absurdist, but kind of in the tradition of educational material. I'm not sure if that's easy to describe. If you've ever seen a film strip, you might know what I meant. He actually did a few of these for, I think it was the Sundance Channel. I don't know if they're online anymore, but I was pulling in people who were making different kinds of visual storytelling. I have tried to avoid including pure animation because the show for me is really about the performative element, the live element, those kinds of things that can't quite translate to video or would lose a lot of their power. So while you might find some videos of my shows on YouTube, I don't think it really has the energy or the excitement of actually being in the room. It's actually really hard to record a live theater piece effectively, I think. Mm-hmm. I've also had Sasha Velour, who was a cartoonist, who is a cartoonist, but she's also a drag artist and was the winner of this year's RuPaul Drag Race. And she did a slideshow where she lip synced and showed slides. It was really great. So I'm always trying to find ways to bring in artists who kind of stretch the boundaries of like a pure comics reading, but a lot of the work that is shown is that plus live music or some other element that sort of like opens it up.
Yeah, and these are taking place primarily in New York, right?
Right. I have done them at various conventions. I've done them at MICE. I've done them at TCAF. I've done them at SPX and at Comic-Con, San Diego Comic-Con. But generally, I do them in New York, mostly at a theater called Dixon Place, mm-hmm. Where I've been working since the 90s. And sometimes I'll do them in other locations for like a particular book event or something like that. But Dixon Place is a real theater, and it's great to be able to work in a space that can kind of accommodate, more than just a projection on the wall, but also various performers dancing or playing music or what have you.
Yeah, and because they're primarily in New York City, I haven't had the pleasure of actually taking part or seeing one of the carousel performances. Maybe next year at SPX, I plan on going. And if you do one there, I will definitely be in the audience.
Well, great. I flog them pretty hard on Twitter, and I have a blog called carouselslideshow.com. Mm-hmm. That has all the shows, and you can read a little bit about the history. Sometimes I've posted photos of the events, and you can see the list of performers I've had. I think I've had about 180 artists on over the course of 20 years. So I'm always trying to get in new people, and that's one of the exciting things about it. When I started doing it, it was mostly people working with slides, which were really expensive. It's so easy to do a slideshow in PowerPoint. The trick is to make it interesting and to be able to perform it live in a way that is dynamic and exciting. So I try to go see a lot of people who do readings, and I invite a lot of new people to try things out. And it's a really exciting form, and I think it grows directly kind of out of the intimacy that you have with comics, but it sort of brings it into a different realm. I think there's something really exciting about seeing an artist read their work, because sometimes you'll get a deeper sense of who they are and where their work is coming from if you can actually kind of let them guide you through it by even something as simple as just a reading with images. And then some people can really make a very emotional event out of it as well.
Yeah, and I will put the web address that you mentioned, carouselslideshow.com, in the show notes. And so if our listeners want to find out more about it, especially if they're in the greater New York area.
Great. Yes, that would be great.
Yes. So, Bob, what you're about to come out with at least the drawn-in quarterly, the Unquotable Trump. What are you working on right now? In other words, what might we expect from our Sikoryak in the not too distant future?
Okay, well,
mini-comic or otherwise.
Okay, well, there's a few things I'm working on. The Terms and Conditions book came out of a series of 24-hour comics that I was making, that I've been continuing to make, that were adaptations of poetry comics. I'm sorry, adaptations of poetry in comics form. So in that series so far, I did a Whitman, a Edgar Allan Poe, a Catullus, and an Emily Dickinson mini-comic. One for each of them. The House of Dickinson is the most recent one, and that one came out a couple of months ago. And that was kind of my palate cleanser after the Trump book. They tend to be drawn super fast. It's sort of a way for me to generate new material and try out some new things. I'm working on a sequel to Masterpiece Comics that requires much more research and painstaking replication of the artists that I'm working with. So I'm working on a number of stories for that. One of them is an adaptation of Moby Dick that I've been grappling with for about 10 years, that I keep putting off, but I really have to get to it already. And that'll be a little bit longer than some of my other ones, but it won't be a full book-length version. But for me, if I do a 20-page comic, that's pretty epic. So that's probably what it will be. One of my pieces from a couple of years ago came out recently, or is coming out again, and that is Sadistic Comics, which is a retelling of the Marquis de Sade's Justine in the style of Wonder Woman comic book covers from the 40s. And that's coming out in the graphic canon of Crime and Mystery, which should be out in November, I believe. And that was actually published in Best American Comics a few years ago.
Did that originally come out from Rotland? It was one of the Rotland Dreadfuls?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Yes. But it's been colored for the new printing.
Okay.
Which it really works in color. It's appropriate to see those covers in color. And then the last thing I'd mentioned is also from Rotland Press. I did an adaptation of the Iliad in the style of the Jumble word game puzzle cartoon. So it's eight episodes from the story of the Iliad, retold as jumbles. And I'm very proud of it because I really love the problem-solving aspect of comics, and I like creating obstacles like that in which to make stories. So it does retell the poem fairly faithfully, as much as you can get in eight episodes. And that came out from Rotland as a print. So it's a limited edition print, but they have copies of that at the Rotland Press website.
Okay. Throughout our conversation today, you've mentioned your various mini comics. Now, I think easy enough for readers to find your books that come out, let's say, from Drawn and Quarterly. But unless someone chances upon you at a comics convention, how could they get your mini comics or find out more about the kind of mini comics that you do?
Well, pretty much all of the mini comics I've made are distributed by Birdcage Bottom Books, which is a great site run by J.T. Yost, who is a great cartoonist and also a tireless promoter of comics
and a nice guy.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't say enough nice things about him. I really appreciate him helping to get my mini comics out in the world, and he sells so many comics on his site from so many creators. It's really a great resource. Even if you don't like my work, there's plenty there that you will. And he also publishes other artists. He has a new anthology out right now, and he makes a lot of work on his own. But the website is chock full of comics that are available for me and other people. Yeah,
so that's the best place for people to check out your mini comics.
I think so. I mean, you could also ask your local comic shop to stock mini comics. That would be another way of doing it. I recently saw one of my mini comics on sale at at Amazon for $50. That's not what you should be paying for my mini comics. And I don't know who that person was, but I don't know if they'll get it. But that's more than they're worth. So JT's prices are appropriately affordable.
Right, a little more in line with what people can get them for at cons.
Oh, absolutely. Often exactly the same amount.
Yeah. Well, Bob, I want to thank you again for taking the time and talking with me for the Comics Alternative in a more sustained way. I did enjoy our conversation at SPX a couple of years ago, and I think we only had it was kind of substantive for being there at a con. I think it was about 20 minutes or so, if I'm not mistaken. But talking with you in a more leisurely way about your larger body of work, I think, is something that I really look forward to. So I want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Derek. This was great. Again, I hope I didn't sound too agitated at the beginning of the call, but I'm honestly just still trying to figure out how to talk about this book. I really enjoyed talking with you, and it was fun.
Yes. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
So there you have it, my conversation with Bob Sikoryak. I want to thank him again for coming on the Comics Alternative and talking about his new book, The Unquotable Trump, as well as a variety of his other comics as well. It's always nice to talk with Bob. And if you want to find great titles like those that R. Sikoryak produces, then you would do well to visit the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. As I mentioned at the top of the show, you can find several of his books at great discounts. The Unquotable Trump, the new book, at 30% off of the cover price. Same with Terms and Conditions, which came out earlier this year. You can get that for 30% off. And Masterpiece Comics, you can find for 25% off at dcbservice.com. And after you do get your Sikoryak comics there, get in touch with me and let me know what you thought about my conversation with Bob. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up that phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can email me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And you can find us all over social media, such as on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, which is comicsalternative.com. We have a lot more interviews lined up in the days to come, so I hope you'll check back for those. Until then, I'm Derek, and I'll be talking at you later.